He bought her to save her from a cruel fate, thinking he was doing the right thing. But who she became, and what she was forced to do, left scars deeper than anyone expected. Eli Kavanaugh first saw her behind the Buckhorn General Store, barefoot and bruised, her lip split, and blood trailing down her cheek, a fresh boot mark pressed into her back like a cruel signature. Her name was Ruthie Lila. She wasn't crying, wasn't pleading, she just stared at the dirt like it might open and swallow her whole. Her husband, drunk and swaggering, had just sold her for $30, a rifle, and a bottle of sour mash. The sheriff, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, muttered that she was barren, no use anymore. There was no ceremony, no law that made it right, just a piece of paper and a trade like livestock. Eli didn't ask what she did to end up in the mud. He didn't believe in questions like that. Instead, he took out the money and said quietly, "She comes with me." No one cheered. No one stopped it. Ruthie didn't speak as he helped her to her feet. She flinched slightly when his hand brushed her arm, but she stood without protest, as if standing itself was a rebellion. Her clothes clung to her like ash, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, heavy with a silence deeper than pain. Eli brought her to his horse, and wrapped her in a wool blanket, careful not to touch more than he needed. She climbed into the saddle, side saddle stiff and silent, holding onto the horn like it was the only thing tethering her to life. They rode north without speaking, leaving behind the shouting and laughter from the saloon where her husband had vanished, richer by one rifle and one bottle, lighter by one soul. The road to Eli's ranch wound through dried-up creek beds and silent canyons, the kind of land that didn't care who you were or what you carried. Ruthie didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask who he was. Her fingers clutched the blanket like armor. Her knees pressed against the bay horse's sides, and every stumble of the animal sent a jolt through her body, but she didn't complain. Eli watched her from the corner of his eye, saw how her wrist bent wrong, like it had once been broken and never healed right, saw the scar on her neck shaped like a hook, saw the way her shoulders stayed tight even when the wind blew gentle. She wasn't fragile. Not real. She looked like someone who had once known how to fight, but had been too beaten down to remember. That night they reached the ranch, a simple stretch of land nestled against low hills and far skies. No white fences, no grand entry, just a main house, a barn, 2 bunkhouses, and cattle that wandered freely like they knew they had time. Eli didn't say much. He tied the horses, took her inside, and showed her to a spare room. The mattress was clean, the flannel shirt folded at the foot of the bed, and a small wash basin sat under the window. "You don't have to earn nothing," he said softly. "You don't owe me." She stood in the doorway, still wrapped in the blanket, eyes darting like she wasn't sure if this was real or another trick waiting to hurt her. Then, with a voice that cracked like a dry branch, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't ask her any questions. He didn't touch her again. He left her door cracked, just enough for light to fall across the floor, and returned to the kitchen where he poured himself black coffee, and listened to the wind creak the shutters. That night, he didn't sleep, not out of fear, but something else, something quiet. The beginning of a story he hadn't meant to start. Ruthie stayed inside for days. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning, swept until the floorboards shone, and cooked meals with a silence that tasted like grief. Eli noticed how she moved, careful, always bracing for impact, like even the walls might turn against her. But slowly, small things changed. Her limp faded, her hands steadied. She stopped jumping at sudden sounds. She began to walk without holding onto the wall, and at night he heard her pacing less and resting more. He didn't interrupt her healing. He just made sure the house was stocked, the animals fed, and her space always safe. One morning he found the flannel shirt hanging on the line, washed and sun-warmed. That was the first time she'd stepped outside. He didn't mention it. He just nodded to her as he passed, letting her have the dignity of her pace. They were strangers still, but strangers bound by something heavier than blood. She wasn't just surviving now, she was testing the idea of living. On the 6th day he came home from the pasture, to find bread baking in the oven. The smell filled the house, warm and stubborn. He said thank you, and she just nodded. Later, she began taking small steps out to the porch, watching the sky at dusk. She stood there every evening, as if waiting for an answer from the hills. Eli watched her once from the kitchen window. Her hair was loose, and the breeze caught it, just enough to make her look like someone half remembered from a better dream. He didn't speak. He let her have the silence. She needed it, needed to stand there and remember who she might have been before the world told her otherwise. One afternoon, he was mucking out the barn when he heard her behind him. She stood at the door, arms folded. "I can help," she said. "I ain't broken." He didn't argue. He handed her a pitchfork, and they worked in rhythm until the sky turned rust and gold. She didn't say much, but that night she ate more than usual, and when she passed him the plate, her hand lingered for a heartbeat longer than before. That night, for the first time, he thought about what it would mean if she never left, if she stayed, and not because she had to, but because she chose to. Ruthie spent her first weeks in Eli's home like a shadow with weight, floating quietly through the house, with no sound except the soft sweep of a broom on already clean floors, and the clink of dishes stacked with careful hands. She cooked meals that didn't need cooking, wiped down windows that didn't need wiping, and moved like someone who didn't know how to sit still without punishment waiting for her. Eli never told her to stop, never asked her to do more. He let her be, watching the small shifts from the corners of his day. Her limp faded little by little, her steps growing steadier, her grip firmer. At night, he noticed she no longer startled when the wind slammed the shutters, and she began standing by the window more often, looking out toward the hills like she was waiting for something, some sign, some ghost, some old version of herself to return. He didn't interrupt her moments. He just made sure the house stayed quiet, that her space was her own, and that when she walked by, his presence didn't press. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice had the edge of someone who hadn't used it in years. She didn't ask about the ranch, about his past, about what he expected. She just existed beside him, her silence folding into his like two pieces of cloth, stitched at the corners, but left free in the middle. One Sunday afternoon, with the sun hanging low and the sweat sticking Eli's shirt to his back as he mucked out the stalls, she appeared in the doorway of the barn. Her arms were folded across her chest, chin raised like it hurt to stand tall. She looked at him with clear eyes, and for the first time her voice held weight. "I can help," she said. "I ain't broken." Eli didn't say anything. He just handed her a pitchfork, stepped aside, and made space. They worked in silence side by side, until the sky turned orange and red and copper. She didn't complain when the fork handle bit into her blistered palm, didn't flinch when manure splattered her skirt, and when they were done, she stood straight and dusted herself off with something close to pride. She even smiled, small but real. That evening, she ate more than usual, chewed slower, and handed Eli his coffee with steady hands. Later, as he sat on the porch, she joined him. Her gaze was steady. "Why'd you buy me?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet like a rifle crack. Eli looked into his cup for a long time before answering. He could have lied, could have said something noble or soft, but instead he told the truth. "It didn't sit right," he said. "What he did, what they all just let happen." She didn't smile, but he noticed the way her shoulders dropped a little, the way her breath didn't hitch like it used to. "You can stay," he told her, "as long as you want." She nodded slowly, eyes still on the horizon. "I'll earn it," she whispered. He didn't argue. He let her believe what she needed to, and in the days that followed, she did more than earn it. She began waking early, moving through the ranch with quiet purpose. She fed the chickens, hauled water, started helping with the morning round. Eli watched her learn the names of the cattle, the squeak of the gate that needed oiling, the patterns of the clouds that told of storms coming in. She wasn't fast, but she was deliberate. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was with weight. The hands started nodding to her, tipping their hats, not out of habit but respect. She started combing her hair at the table, a small gesture of comfort that spoke louder than any confession. One morning, she laughed barely more than a breath, but Eli heard it from the other room, and it stopped him in his tracks. That sound, so rare and soft, settled into him like warmth after frost. Still at night she stood by the window, eyes fixed on the dark hill. Once, he asked, "What do you see out there?" She didn't answer for a long time. Then finally, she said, "I'm just checking if the past is still following." He understood. He didn't ask more. Days turned to weeks, and Eli realized she was changing the house without meaning to. The air felt different, like something was growing, where silence used to rot. She added herbs to the stew, rearranged the tools in the shed, mended shirts that had hung untouched for years. She found old furniture under tarps, and cleaned them, until the wood shook. She even started a ledger counting supplies, marking cattle, scribbling small notes in the margins, like she was rewriting the shape of her days. One number at a time. Eli never told her to stop. He just brought home more notebooks. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew it mattered. One evening, while stacking hay, he felt her watching him. She stood near the fence, arms resting on the top rail, her eyes calm, but curious. "You always live alone out here?" she asked. "Since the war," he replied. "It's quiet here. No one asks much of you. You like it that way?" she asked. He shrugged. "Used to." "Not so sure now." She nodded, but didn't smile. Later that night, as the wind howled against the eaves, she came into the kitchen, where he was warming coffee. She took a cup, sat down across from him, and for the first time, she looked at him, like a person, not a stranger, not a man who traded cash for broken women. "You think I'm gonna stay?" she asked. He met her gaze. "I hope so," he said. She looked down, fingers tightening around the cup. "I don't know what that looks like. We'll figure it out," he said. And that, for now, was an. Time moved like river water, steady and unspoken, and Ruthie began to settle into the rhythm of life on the ranch. She and Eli rode side by side along the fence lines, checking for breaks, herding cattle that wandered too far, and mending what was frayed. She learned how to gut a deer with quick, clean hands, how to check the sky for signs of storm, and how to brace her stance when she fired a rifle. The work came naturally, as if some part of her remembered what it felt like to build, instead of just endure. But the nights still carried weight. Sometimes he'd wake to find the door to the barn open, and see her curled against a hay bale, arms wrapped around herself like armor. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just shook, as though her bones were trying to rattle out memories too sharp to keep. One night, Eli sat beside her in the straw, not speaking, just breathing with her, until the shaking slowed. The air smelled of dust and horses, and the silence between them said more than comfort ever could. "You're not back there," he whispered. "No one's coming for you now." She didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice so small he almost missed it, she said, "I believe you." And those words struck something deep in him, because trust, from someone who had none left to give, was worth more than any vow. The town, small and always watching, noticed Ruthie's presence more now. Gossip passed from front porches to bar counters like smoke. They called her the broken woman, said Eli was keeping her like a stray, said maybe he bought her because no one else would look his way. Eli heard the whispers, but he didn't respond. He didn't have to. Ruthie heard them too, but instead of shrinking, she grew. She stood taller, walked with purpose. She began wearing her hair down, letting the wind catch it when she rode. Something in her eyes changed too, less guarded, more present, like she was daring the world to try again. Around the ranch, she moved like someone who'd always belonged there. She kept the books now, balanced the feed orders, counted every calf born and every fence post repaired. The ranch hands followed her lead, not because she demanded it, but because she saw everything and missed nothing. Once, one of the younger hands cut corners fixing a gate, and she called him out, calm but firm. He didn't argue, he just fixed it proper, and from then on, they called her ma'am without sarcasm. Still, it wasn't just what she did, it was how she lived. She moved through the world like someone who had learned how precious a safe place was, and wasn't about to let it slip away. Her voice grew stronger, used less often, but better without meaning. She didn't laugh much, but when she did, it was always real. Eli watched all of it quietly. He didn't try to define it, didn't rush her. He just made sure the coffee pot was full, and that the porch was swept each morning. They ate meals together now, not out of obligation, but because it felt natural. She even started setting 2 plates without asking. One morning, as he sat with his cup, reading the shipping records, he felt her eyes on him. He looked up, and for the first time she didn't look away. There was something steady in her gaze, something that asked a question, without needing to say it out loud. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. She didn't hesitate. "Not anymore," she said, her voice low but sure. Then, as she passed him the coffee, her hand brushed his. It stayed there warm and light, longer than it had to, and neither of them moved. In that small, still touch, something shifted. Not a confession, not a promise, but a beginning of something real. After that, the silence between them changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of glances that lasted too long, hands that hovered before letting go, footsteps that paused outside doors. Ruthie began humming softly as she worked. Nothing loud, just small melodies that floated through the rooms like sunlight. She hung dried lavender in the kitchen, started a little garden patch outside the back door. She planted rosemary, onions, and a single rosebush. "Might not live," she said, one morning, wiping dirt from her hands. "Might," he replied, handing her a glass of water. And sometimes when the sun sank low, they would sit on the porch together without saying anything, just watching the sky turn orange and the cattle find their way home. One evening, after a long ride, they dismounted in silence. Ruthie handed him the reins, then reached up and tucked a stray curl behind his ear, her fingers lingering near his cheek. He didn't move, didn't breathe for a second too long. Then she smiled, turned, and walked inside. That night, he found her asleep, in the rocking chair, book open on her chest, legs curled like a cat in a sunbeam. He didn't wake her, just laid a blanket over her, and sat nearby, watching the fire crackle. The world outside still talked, still judged, but inside the ranch, something sacred was growing, not loudly, not with fireworks, but with every breath they didn't waste, every glance that meant more than words, every quiet morning, when 2 mugs of coffee steamed side by side on the counter. Ruthie had stopped surviving. She was beginning to live, and Eli, without meaning to, was starting to hope, not for the past to be erased, but for the future to grow roots. There were still nights when she shook, still moments when loud noises made her stiffen, but now, she came back quicker. She looked for him when it happened, and he was always there. Once, after a thunderclap sent her to the floor, he helped her up, and she didn't cry. She just held onto his arm, a second longer than usual, and whispered, "I'm still learning." "Me too." And somehow, that made it better. The house felt different now, lived in, steady. One night, Eli heard music coming from the kitchen, a small battered radio she'd found in the attic. The song was scratchy but sweet, and when he stepped into the doorway, he saw her dancing alone, slow and barefoot, eyes closed. She opened them, saw him watching, and didn't stop. She just held out a hand. He hesitated, then took it. They danced without music after that, sometimes in the barn, sometimes in the yard, sometimes without even moving their feet. And with each passing day, Eli realized that love, real love, wasn't something you claimed. It was something you waited for, something you built one quiet hour at a time. One cold February night, the calm Ruthie had been slowly building shattered in a single breath, as the door of the town saloon slammed open with the force of old ghosts. Her past didn't walk in quietly. It roared in with a drunken swagger and the foul breath of sour mash. There he was, the man who had sold her for $30, a rifle and a bottle, the one who once called her wife and treated her like property. He stood in the doorway, unshaven, loud, waving the brittle sale paper like a badge of ownership, shouting to anyone who'd listen, "I've come to take back what's mine." The words echoed in the quiet street, and spilled into the cold night like venom. People stared. Some whispered. Some turned away, pretending not to see what they did not want to get involved in. Word reached Ruthie quickly. She was sitting on the porch of the ranch, staring into the snowy dark, her fingers clenched white around the edge of her blanket, jaw hard enough to crack stone. Eli stepped out quietly, his voice soft but steady. You want me to handle it? He asked, already prepared to protect her, already ready to finish it, but Ruthie shook her head, her voice calm and unshaking. No, I ain't broken. And with that she stood, pulled her coat around her shoulders, and mounted her horse like she was going to war, not to ask for peace, but to make sure it would never be questioned again. Her breath clouded in the freezing air as she rode into town, each hoofbeat against the hard earth, sounding like a heartbeat, getting louder. She didn't speak as she entered the saloon. She didn't flinch at the eyes that turned to her, or the gasps that passed through the crowd. Her ex-husband stood near the bar, shouting, slapping at the waitress, laughing like he was king of the room. He turned just in time to see her walk in, chin high, spine straight, eyes like iron. Well, well, he sneered, stumbling a little. Ain't you got soft living up there with the cowboy and the cattle? Ruthie didn't answer. She stepped forward, and with one clean motion, punched him square in the face. He fell hard, the room gasping as he hit the floor with a dull thud. Blood ran from his nose as he pushed himself up slowly, fury in his eyes, and reached for a knife in his boot. Before he could even raise it, Ruthie had drawn her revolver. She didn't point it. She didn't have to. The gleam of metal was enough. Her voice was cold as the night outside. You lost the right to call me anything. I was never yours. Not then. Not now. You sold me like a cow. And now you want to talk like a man who still has pride. You have nothing. You are nothing. The bar was silent, all eyes fixed on the woman who stood unmoved, gun in hand, eyes full of truth. The man's bravado melted, and with a mix of fear and rage, he backed away, muttering curses under his breath, one hand cradling his ribs, the other trying to find dignity on the way out the door. Ruthie holstered her gun and turned to Eli, who had stood quietly at the entrance, not interfering, just watching, ready if needed, but letting her lead. Let's go, she said. He nodded, and they left the way they came, side by side, no words between them. The snow had started to fall, big flakes floating down from the sky like the world was trying to clean itself. On the ride back, the silence was gentle. Eli glanced over, searching her face for cracks. You all right? He asked, not out of worry, but from the need to know if she felt it too, that moment of shift of power reclaimed. Ruthie looked ahead for a long time, then turned to him, and for the first time in a long while, her smile was soft. Yeah, she said, I think I am. Back at the ranch, the house was warm, the fire still crackling low in the hearth. Ruthie didn't speak. She took off her coat, set her boots by the door, and moved down the hallway toward her room. Eli watched her go, the air thick with something unsaid. But then, in the early hours before dawn, her footsteps returned. She didn't knock, she just pushed his door open, slow and quiet, and stepped inside. He was still awake, had been since they got back. She walked to his bed, lay down beside him, and pulled the blanket over them both. They didn't touch, didn't say a single word, but the air between them was full of everything they didn't need to explain. They just breathed slow, steady, together. Eli stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of her inhale and exhale, matching his own to her. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, he felt something loosen inside his chest, something that had been wound tight for years. Not just relief, not just respect, but something older, deeper, a belief that she had turned the tide, not just for herself, but for them both. The woman who once knelt in the mud behind a store, who had been traded and tossed aside, had just stood in the heart of town and reminded the world who she really was. And now she lay beside him, not broken, not silent, but whole, and choosing to be there. He didn't sleep for a long while, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to miss it. That feeling, that moment, the quiet, where everything changed. By the second winter on the ranch, Ruthie was no longer the woman people whispered about. She had become something else entirely. Someone no one dared to pity. Someone who stood taller than the past ever imagined she could. She ran the ranch with the sharp eye of a hawk, and the patience of someone who had learned to survive in silence. She handled payroll, taught the younger ranch hands how to respect the land and themselves, and kept the books so clean that even Eli found himself trusting her numbers more than his own memory. The same men who once spat behind her back, calling her a bought woman, now tipped their hats and addressed her as ma'am, not because they were told to but because she had earned it in sweat, in silence, in steadiness. Eli watched this change like someone witnessing a storm turn to bloom. She didn't belong to him. He knew that deep in his bones, but he was beginning to understand that maybe he belonged to her, in ways that had nothing to do with ownership, and everything to do with faith. Then without warning came the fire. It started with 3 cattle found dead in the northern pasture, charred where they stood, the fence beside them sawed clean, oil-soaked rags smoldering in the grass. Eli stared at the scene with a clenched jaw, but Ruthie crouched low and studied the ash like it held secrets. "This isn't random," she said. "This is a message. They think I made you soft." She didn't wait for permission. She got to work. That night she laid out every rifle in the house, oiled them, loaded them, checked each one twice. She began training the ranch hands, not just to herd and fix and haul but to fire. She taught them how to fire from cover, how to move without sound, where to place a shot that would stop a man without killing him. Her instructions were calm, measured, and sharp. The men followed her not with fear but with certainty. They knew she had been through wars no one had seen. Then one evening, just as the last light slipped behind the hills, a rifle cracked across the valley. The barn's weather vanes spun and split in two. Eli ducked instinctively, but Ruthie didn't flinch. She was already moving, already scanning the ridgeline. "South slope," she said. "Sniper, high ground." Without waiting, she grabbed her rifle and started up the trail, moving fast and low, her body weaving through sage and stone, like she was part of the land itself. Eli followed close, not questioning, just trusting. They climbed the shale, breath steady, boots quiet. At the top, Ruthie dropped to one knee and sighted in. A glint of metal betrayed the shooter's position. She exhaled slow and squeezed the trigger. One shot. The man tumbled from the ridge, rifle still strapped to his chest, body limp as cloth. Ruthie didn't celebrate. She didn't even blink. "He's the start," she said, "not the end." They climbed back down in silence. That night she didn't sleep. Instead she sat at the kitchen table, drawing maps of the ranch's borders, marking weak points, planning rotations. "They're not trying to steal. They're trying to test us, trying to see how far they can push before we fold." Eli leaned against the counter, watching her hand move across the page. "Then we won't fold," he said. She nodded once, then kept drawing. Over the next few days they set up posts along the creek and laid traps near the outer fields. Ruthie dug in like someone who had nothing left to lose. She trained even harder, her voice low and commanding. One of the ranch hands, a boy no older than 16, asked her once where she'd learned to do all this. She didn't look up from cleaning her rifle. "From people who thought I couldn't," she said. When they found the fence cut again a week later, there was no fire, but a calf lay dead with its neck broken, a strip of skin peeled from its back like a warning. Ruthie stood over the body, eyes narrowed. "This isn't about cattle," she said. "It's about pride." Eli crossed his arm. "Mine or yours?" She didn't answer. That night she packed a saddlebag and saddled her horse. "Where are you going?" Eli asked. "South," she said. "There might be someone who remembers me, and maybe has a reason to hate me." He offered to ride with her. "No," she said. "This one's mine." And with that she disappeared into the dark, leaving the ranch in his hands, trusting he'd hold it until she came back. Nash came at dusk, just as the sky was bruising into dark, leading 20 armed men down into the valley with rifles on their shoulders and torches in their fists. He rode in the center, puffed up like a bull who'd never been challenged, wearing a clean white hat, like it might hide the filth underneath. They stopped just past rifle range from the ranch gate, their horses restless beneath them, nostrils flaring with smoke and arrogance. Ruthie stood beside Eli on the porch, rifle in hand, jaw tight, eyes clear. Nash smirked at the sight. "You gonna let a woman fight your war for you?" he shouted across the cold space. Eli didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "I'm letting her finish it," he called back. That answer rolled like thunder. Nash opened his mouth again, but Ruthie moved first. Calm, practiced, deliberate. Her rifle cracked once, and one of Nash's men screamed, falling from his horse, clutching his thigh. The others tensed, unsure whether to charge or retreat. Nash roared, trying to regain control, but Ruthie stood still, smoke curling from her rifle barrel like a promise. He shouted more threats, but they didn't move, didn't answer. Eventually he pulled his men back into the shadows, but Ruthie knew it wasn't the end. It never ended with men like him. It paused. That night, under a moonless sky, Nash's men came back. No warning, no words, just fire. Bottles of burning liquor were thrown into the hay store, fences cut, cattle driven wild by noise and flame. But Ruthie had been ready. She had seen it coming in the wind, heard it in the way the birds stopped singing. Her people, now hers as much as Eli's, were already waiting in the shadows. They lit backfires, redirected the blaze, and corralled the cattle away from chaos. Bullets flew in the dark, muzzle flashes lighting up faces twisted in fear and fury. Ruthie moved through it all like a storm. She dropped one man with a clean shot to the shoulder, knocked another from his horse, and drove the butt of her rifle into a third man's jaw with such force he didn't rise again. She wasn't graceful, she was devastating. She shouted orders the way a general would, not louder than fear but sharper. Eli fought beside her, but everyone followed her. The ranch hands, once farm boys and drifters, now moved like soldiers. By dawn the flames were out, the cattle safe, and the bodies of Nash's men scattered in retreat, or tied and bleeding beside the barn. Nash wasn't among them. He had watched from a distance, hiding behind hills and shadows, keeping his own skin safe, while sending others to die. Ruthie stood in the frost-covered pasture, rifle across her back, eyes on the horizon. She knew he'd come again. He wouldn't stop until something inside him was broken beyond repair, or dead. Eli walked up beside her, dirt on his hands, smoke in his beard, the lines on his face deeper than the day before. "Why not run?" he asked, his voice not weak, but wondering. She turned to him, not angry, not surprised, just honest. "Because if I run, I go back to being a ghost," she said. "I won't disappear again, not for him, not for anyone." Eli nodded slowly. There was no more to say. She had already said everything that mattered. In the days that followed, they fortified the ranch even further. Trenches dug by the north end, sandbags stacked behind the barn, iron nails scattered on the trails leading in. Ruthie took the lead on it all, drawing plans, posting guards, cleaning weapons. The men followed without hesitation, the youngest looking at her like she was carved from iron, the oldest tipping their hats with genuine respect. Eli kept close when she needed him, distant when she did. He knew what this cost her, not just the danger, but the return to the woman she once had to be to survive. A woman who thought ahead like a predator, and slept with a weapon near her chest. At night he'd find her in the barn, hand pressed against the colt's neck, not saying anything, just grounding herself in breath and touch and warmth. She didn't talk about fear, but he could see it in her stillness, in the way she paused too long in doorways, or double-checked the locks after the others had gone to sleep. He hated that the world still tried to take from her, still tried to claim what she had earned, but he didn't stop her, because what she was doing wasn't just defense, it was declaration. One evening, while sharpening her knife, she looked over at him and asked, "If he kills me, will you keep this place going?" Eli didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "I'll burn it to the ground before I let it exist without you." She didn't answer, just nodded once. It was enough. They waited, not in fear, but in readiness, and in the waiting, something strange happened. They laughed once over a spilled pot of stew. She sang a line of an old hymn, when she thought no one was listening. He caught her reading by candlelight, her fingers brushing over words like they were magic. The ranch still stood, the skies still shifted from blue to gold to night, and for a moment each day, it almost felt like peace. But Ruthie knew peace wasn't permanent, not yet. The wind told her that, the silence told her that, and somewhere, in the hills, Nash was sharpening his knives, and gathering the last pieces of his pride. She didn't fear him, but she did expect him. 3 nights after the smoke cleared, and silence returned to the hills, it ended, not with fire or thunder, but with the kind of stillness that only comes before something final. The moon was a thin silver blade in the sky when Ruthie stepped out of the house, already dressed in dark wool and leather, revolver at her hip, knife strapped across her back. Eli met her by the fence line, where frost still clung to the wooden posts, and the cattle stirred restlessly in the far fields, sensing the tension in the air. She didn't speak, didn't ask if he was ready. They just stood together, shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the eastern ridge, where 6 riders appeared like shadows on horseback. Nash was among them, sitting tall in the saddle, with a sneer carved into his face, and a pistol in each hand, flanked by men too proud to admit fear, but smart enough to feel it. They dismounted in a slow line, approaching without hurry, the frost crunching beneath their boots. No war cries, no shouting, just purpose. When they reached speaking distance, Nash stepped forward, eyes locked on Ruthie like she was the devil he'd never managed to outrun. "I don't want land," he said, spitting into the dirt. "I want her dead." Eli didn't move. He didn't even twitch. Ruthie stepped ahead of him, steady and unflinching. "You remember what I was," she said, voice cold as iron. "I'm worse now." Her hand went to her hip, smooth and sure. She drew before Nash could blink, before his breath hitched in his throat. One shot hit his thigh, the next shattered his collarbone. Nash went down in the dust, gasping, eyes wide with disbelief. His men reached for their guns, but paused when Eli raised his rifle, calm and quiet. "You want to die for him?" he asked. "Or you want to walk away breathing?" One by one, they dropped their weapons and backed away, not looking at Nash, not looking at Ruthie, just glad to still have their lives. Ruthie walked to where Nash lay squirming in the dirt, one hand reaching for a pistol that wasn't there. She knelt beside him, not with pity, but with precision. "You were right about one thing," she whispered. "What I used to be is gone, but what I am now you should have never let live." She stood up, wiped her hand on her coat, and walked away, not looking back even once. Eli joined her at the gate. "Leave him," she said. "Let the earth decide what he's worth." They didn't speak again that night. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, Ruthie walked out to the barn, and buried her guns beneath the floorboards, not out of shame, but out of peace. She poured a line of salt over the place, and whispered something no one else could hear. Then she went to the garden, and began planting herbs, lavender, thyme, rosemary, her fingers working the soil like it was something sacred. She stayed there for hours, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, watching the clouds drift like lazy ghosts overhead. Eli came out and sat beside her. She didn't speak at first. She just leaned back on her hands, and looked at the land like it was finally fully hers. "I don't dream of running anymore," she said quietly. "Do you dream at all?" he asked. She looked at him with something soft in her eyes. "Sometimes I see that first night," she said. "The mud, my hands, you." Eli nodded slowly. "I see it too. Used to wake up screaming." She tilted her head and smiled, the kind of smile that comes when healing finally takes hold. "Now I just reach for your hand." He reached for hers, and she let him take it. They sat like that until the sun dipped behind the hills, and the stars began blinking away. In time, the ranch healed. The cattle grazed calmly. The wind carried only the sounds of birds and creaking fence lines. The men stayed longer, some never leaving. There was something different in the dirt now, something rooted deeper than fences or barns. Ruthie became more than just the woman who fought a war. She became something else entirely. Not famous, not loud, but known. Women who passed through town, battered or running, or lost, heard the story of her, and followed the road to the ranch like it was a trail home. They came with their heads low and their hearts bruised, and Ruthie welcomed them with work and warmth and silence when words weren't needed. She taught them how to shoot if they wanted, how to cook if they didn't. She never asked what they ran from. She just helped them build what came next. Eli watched it all with a quiet pride, fixing roofs and wrangling strays and learning, slowly, how to laugh again. He never called what they had love, not out loud, but it was in every cup of coffee left warm on the stove, in every shoulder brushed in the hallway, in every silence they didn't rush to fill. They shared a life made not from rescue, but respect, not from pity, but choice. And the land, which once seemed endless and cruel, now held something sacred, memories that had been turned to roots, blood turned to bloom. Ruthie never called herself a hero, she didn't need to. Her name became a whisper, passed in saloons, and over campfires, not because she was saved, but because she saved herself, and showed others how to do the same. She was proof that survival wasn't the end of a story, sometimes it was just where the legend began.